Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Top 5 DEI, the premier podcast for and about DEI professionals. I'm your host, Jason Lambert, aka Dr. J, and my goal is to interview every person in the world who manages, practices, teaches, researches, or publishes anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm so glad you tuned in, and if you are ready to learn about some insightful DEI practices from experts from all over the world, and about DEI experiences from people just like you, join me and let's dive right in. Hey everybody, welcome back to Top 5 DEI. I'm your host, Dr. J, here with my producer, Micah Gilman, who's the moderator, does all the work in the background for everyone. We are the premier podcast for and about DEI professionals. And today I have a very, very special guest. A lot of people don't know this, but this individual actually is who inspired me to start a podcast. And I learned everything I know about podcasting from this individual. You need to make sure you check out their podcast, Diversity Matters. And if you just Google that and their name, Dr. Oscar Holmes IV, Roman numeral 4, you will see it. Okay. And there's so much more I want to say about him, but as always, let me jump right into the bio. And for those who are new, as you know, we ask 5 questions. And at the end, we ask our guests what are their top 5 favorites, top 5 preferences, and they have to tell us why. That's the fun part. So Dr. Oscar Holmes IV, who is a senior certified professional with SHRM, is the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Programs, an Associate Professor of Management and the Rutgers University Student Executive Director at Rutgers School of Business-Camden, where he has taught executive education, graduate and undergraduate courses in leadership, organizational behavior, conflict management and negotiation, and crisis management. Additionally, he is the founder of WHConsulting Firm LLC and creator and host of Diversity Matters podcast. His research examines how leaders can maximize productivity and well-being through fostering more inclusive environments and has been published in several top-tier management journals and books. He earned a PhD in management from the University of Alabama, a Master of Liberal Arts from the University of Richmond, and a bachelor's with honors from Virginia Commonwealth University. He has won numerous awards for his leadership, scholarship, and teaching, such as being named one of Philadelphia Business Journal's 40 Under 40 and Diversity Leaders in Business honorees. One of Diversity MBA Top 100 Under 50 Emerging and Executive Leaders, Philadelphia Tribune Top 10 Under 40 Most Influential African Americans to Watch, and won a Rutgers University Leaders and Faculty Diversity Award in 2020. Get this, one of Poets and Quant's 40 Under 40 Best Business School Professors in the world, and won the Mid-Atlantic Association of College of Business Administration Innovation and Teaching Award and the New Jersey Policy Research Organization Foundation Bright Idea Research Award in 2018 and 2020. In addition to his scholarship being covered in various news outlets, he is a TEDx speaker. And this is another thing you need to Google. Google his name and TEDx to see at this TEDx presentation about police brutality in less conspicuous ways that racism kills. And there's also a journal article, publication on this as well. I think came out in maybe 2020. He's a TEDx speaker, organizational consultant, and has made a number of media appearances that include Huffington Post Live, television, and radio interviews. He can be reached at oscar.holmes4, and that's Roman numeral 4 IV, at rutgers.edu, or oholmes4 at WHConsultingFirm.com. Dr. Holmes, welcome.
Thank you so much for this welcome, Dr. Lambert, and please call me Oscar throughout this.
Okay,
everyone, please call me Oscar. But it's always humbling when you hear bios, and again, as a podcast host, I sit in your seat, right? I have to say the bios for my guests, and being on the other side now, it's like really humbling, and I appreciate your attention to the bio, and thank you for that.
Well, man, you're very welcome. And thank you for being on the show. I think it's very important. And sometimes I had one guest that said, I didn't know you were going to read the whole thing. But I said,
I
that's
didn't know you were.
Yeah, no, that's what we do on this show. We read the whole thing, right? So, give people their flowers. So thank you. You've done a lot. You are one of the people who I aspire to be, look up to. We started with the PhD project together. As I was telling Micah before, you were so open, so welcoming. I was like the new kid on the block, and you were like, hey, Jason, I'm Oscar. What's up? We just hung out and really got to know you. And it really helped me, especially being new to academia and being new to the whole, doctoral program and teaching and things like that. It really made me feel comfortable and I think helped me be successful. So thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, it's indeed my pleasure. And I will say the feeling is mutual. It's mutual success. And you've also helped me along this journey. For all of those who are listening, we're part of the 2008 PhD project cohort. And so we've been great supporters of all of us. So you have helped me just as much as I helped you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I'm sure all our listeners want to know the first question, and that is, how did you get into the DEI field? You could tell us your journey.
That's a good question, and one that I've been asked before, as you can imagine, by a lot of people. And so the answer typically is never this exact same that I give. But what I would say is, when I started my PhD program, I always knew I wanted to study some aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Being a member of a variety of historically excluded identity groups, I've experienced various isms throughout my life. And I see my family, and I could see the types of systemic issues that we face as a family who have, various historically excluded or marginalized identities. And so I have had a career in several different industries, but when I made the decision to, stop working full time and go back to school to get a PhD in management, and then I'll say in management, there were some instrumental reasons why I chose management, just to be open and transparent. But beyond the instrumental reasons I chose management, what really attracted me to this field was this idea that we spend a lot of our waking hours at work, right? And if you look at business and business people in general, we have an outsized impact on really our society and how decisions are made and how people live and the impact of the decisions that we make on those people. And so I wanted to get into a field where I thought I could have, some good societal impact. And, at one point I thought about becoming, a practitioner myself, just working in a corporate America and working my way up. But in 2006, I had the opportunity to attend Stanford University's Summer General Management Institute. And this was a month-long leadership development institute. And while I was there, I got a chance to see the professors, right, on the stage. And, we were doing all these cases and like MBA truck type of stuff, because typically the path is either the students will, advance in their company, or they will be pipelined to these top MBA programs. That's kind of like the idea of why Stanford was offering this program. And so as I was there, I just kept going back to being a manager is good and all, but the professors really impacted me. And I was like, wow, if I could be like them, imparting this information and having this type of impact on all of these people who would then go out into these organizations and make a difference. To me, I felt that was just a pathway that this just felt right to me. And as I left that in 2006, I knew I didn't want to go the route of MBA and be a manager, that I actually did want the PhD and be a professor for the managers. And so that got me into, a business PhD. But again, I think everyone does DEI work, right? I think regardless of what we research, we do DEI work. It's just that some of our work is framed as DEI, right? And others isn't framed as DEI, because if you're doing research on people are made up of various identity groups, right?
That's right.
And so if I'm doing a leadership study and the majority of my people in my leadership study is white men, you're still studying race and you're still studying gender. I always say it's just silent, right? You're just not calling attention to it, right? And so I say that to say, like, all of us really do study DI in some aspect. It's just that some of us put it at the center of how we frame our research. And we come to this research with various different ethos and beliefs and values. And so I go a step above and beyond, like yourself, right? Because I center DEI in a lot of the work I do to try to mitigate biases that people experience. I try to understand, the identity threats that people experience. I try to understand all of these different isms in the workplace that make work just harder for people. And so I know there's probably was a long-winded answer of how I got to this research, but again, as a person who has various marginalized identities, it's not enough for me to just collect a good paycheck. I really do feel like I have to give back to my community and be responsible to the members of my community to do, to put my expertise to good, to improve the communities.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. I'm glad you decided to go that route, to be the professor, to train the new leaders out there, because it makes such a huge impact. And I love that perspective about everybody who does DEI work. It's about, if it's solid or if it's variety, heterogeneity, and where you're focused or what you decide to center. That's a great way to look at it. What's a project that you're currently working on or you've worked on that you would like to share? Tell us about it.
Yeah, so I have been fortunate to work with a variety of different scholars. And for those of you, who listen in, who know about academia, we have levels to this, right? It's no surprise. There's like A journals, B journals, C journals, all this type of stuff. And so I'm very fortunate to have published several A-level journals, top-tier journal articles, right? And these are, quote unquote, the articles that supposedly make the biggest impact in the field. They pass the most rigor and all those type of things.
Yeah,
Again,
I'm still trying.
Supposedly.
I'm still trying to catch up with you, man.
But I tell people, and I'm so thankful for all of those A journal articles that I've been able to publish with my fabulous co-authors. But I will say, and I wrote it in a book chapter that's going to come out later on. I think the most impactful article that I've written to date is the 2020 EDI article that I wrote about police brutality in the less conspicuous ways that racism kills Black people. And the reason why I think that's my most impactful article is because it was so for the moment, right? It was an article that was planned in my queue. It was an article that the content came about because of the tragic killing of George Floyd, right? And it was when preparation really met opportunity at that moment. I was able to synthesize our whole field and be able to articulate why this is so important. And the little bit of the little, inconspicuous things that people think don't make a difference, how impactful those things are. And it just so happened that is the article that I subsequently turned into a TEDx talk that has been really well received worldwide. I've gotten messages from people all over the world who have watched it and they told me like they cried afterwards. And, some people responded to me via email saying, "Oh, you articulated what I wanted to say, but I just didn't have the words to say." And so that for me is what scholarship is all about. It's not just about where I publish my work. If it's hit the top tier, quote unquote, A journal articles, it's not. It's about the content and the quality of that work and what the purpose of that work and how it's received by the general public, not just the other scholars in the field. And, those 4 less conspicuous ways that I mentioned in that article, I only talked about 3 in the TEDx talk because of timing. They are deep ways. And I think they are really important for people to examine themselves and take a moment to reflect on, the less conspicuous things. And so for those who haven't had a chance to read the article or, listen to the talk, the first thing I say in terms of the less conspicuous ways that racism kills. So of course we know all about the police brutality, right? That's like really conspicuous. We can see that But what happens in our society, because most people don't engage in this conspicuous type of racism, right? They're not police officers and, they don't do that type of stuff. You're like, well, that's just them. It's a them issue. It's not me. But the four other ways, the first way was this perennial expectation that people have, this expectation of Black people to cater to the other desires and needs of other people, right? And so the example that I talk about in the paper is the tragic death of the AME parishioners in South Carolina, Dylan Ruth murder. And, it was this call for us to forgive, and we see this play over and over and over again, this expectation that we're supposed to forgive. Or if something happens, you are the victim, but then the perpetrator may start crying or whatever. And it's like, oh, you got to cater to this person's desire, cater to this person's needs to make them feel better about themselves. And it's just become this script that we are expected to play. And that also kills us, right? Because we are left with the burden and obviously the physiological of negative health outcomes that come with those things. The second way was performative activism and allyship. And of course, I define what that is, and I won't go into it at this point, but we have too many people and too many organizations just play in our faces, pretending that they're allies and pretending that, they are down for the cause, but it's just performative. They're just seeking to get something out of it for themselves or try to position themselves in some way to benefit from it. And that is pernicious form of racism because it diverts attention and resources from legitimate people and causes that people can focus on. And again, it decenters the people who should be centered. And I give examples of how we have seen that happen, whether it's the NFL, what they did with, painting in racism at the end zone, but still firing Colin Kaepernick and doing all the other things, right, that they do. And so the third thing was assigning Black people the responsibility to fix racism. Whereas Black people as a group of people in this community, we have been at the forefront of civil rights struggles and civil rights movements, right? And we've done a lot of the heavy lifting and lion's share of this work and, to create a more just society. But everyone needs to realize that is not Black people's responsibility to fix society. Black people didn't create these issues. And so what we have seen is this, and we've seen it with a variety of different types of events that have come up most recently, but it's this expectation, right, that, oh, Black people are supposed to carry the mantle and fix this issue and everyone else's issue as well. And finally, there's this ideology that, education or mentoring or wealth is a panacea for racism, right? It's like, well, if they only got more schooling, education, like a master's degree, a doctorate degree, or if they were just, become an entrepreneur and make some money, then racism would just disappear. Like it's a panacea. And that type of thinking is very pernicious to us as a society as well. Because again, one, it put the onus of fixing racism on Black people. And so it creates this ideology that, again, if you would only do this or if you would only do that, then you wouldn't be dealing with this problem. And of course, we have several examples we know the backlash when we think about the Tulsa massacre, right? Black Wall Street or Atlanta or Chicago and all these cities, right? When Black communities are thriving, the backlash and the violence that comes from that, as well as individuals. So we think about people like Oprah and the racism that she experienced, right? And she's uber wealthy, or Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Harvard professor who was, profiled by police officers. So this idea that if only you just do this, racism will cease, it's deeply ingrained in American culture, society, but it is deeply flawed. And again, one of the ways that these less conspicuous forms of racism kill us as well.
Yeah, I think that was one of your best papers too. I love that project. I can't recall if it was from I like the examples that you also post to. I can't remember if it was from the paper or the TEDx talk. You even talk about how, not Walgreens, Walmart, like huge store. One of their ways to kind of address racism was to, we're going to unlock all the beauty supply, the Black beauty supply product. That was crazy, right?
Right.
So there's these like very superficial, performative actions that companies do. I also liked the TEDx talk, especially. You say how it was this moment of opportunity and preparation. I also think it almost like it was coming from your spirit. Like, this is something that you had to do this. And you talk about the story of your grandfather, and how what I love was the revelation of how when you learn what it is to be black. Right?
Right.
And there are many stories, and we read readings about the experiences that people have. I think I have this as even an assignment in one of my classes. Like, when did you first realize your race or your identity and compared to the rest of the world? But yeah, I think that was awesome. And you talk about Henry Louis Gates in one of your other papers that I like too. I know this isn't about all your papers, but you talk about compensatory strategies that people use, avoidance and all the different strategies in order to navigate as a minoritized individual. So I just wanted to put that out there too, so that people can really read and enjoy your work. So we talked about DEI, we talked about the formative allyship, we talked about the backlash, in regards to when that pendulum swings back and forth, when there's progress, and then we have those naysayers that then want to kind of push that back. Within organizations, I want to ask you, what do you believe is the most common reason why DEI faces backlash in some companies?
That's a great question. I think the most common reason really is the entrenched prejudice that people have. Our society, and not just our society, societies in general around the world, right? There are hierarchies in societies. And with those hierarchies, there's power. And so some people have power and other people don't have power. And so when it comes to organizations, this is just an extension to a different part of our society. Like, there's power within organizations and there's less power, right? And so many times people adopt the zero-sum ideology, which is, if I give you something, that means that I'm going to lose something, versus an integrative ideology, which is, we can expand this pie and all of us can be made better. So essentially, people just take into organizations all of the prejudices and attitudes that they get from society to maintain differential power imbalances within workplaces. Second, there's this, I've talked about zero sum and integrative beliefs before, but there's this idea that, some people just aren't worthy as well. Again, these are attitudinal beliefs that people have. There's a feeling that I deserve this and these other groups don't deserve that. And again, it's this social comparison thing to go on. If these people get this, then that's going to change my status or standing. And so, for example, we think about reparations for African Americans, right? This has been a conversation for decades. It's not a conversation that doesn't have any basis in reality. We do know of other identity groups that have reparations, right? The most egregious form, right, was when slave owners were actually compensated after the end of Civil War for the enslaved people that they had. So instead of the enslaved people being compensated for their labor and for the awful hell that they experienced, the actual slave owners were compensated because they were viewed as property, right? But again, there's other groups as well that, reparations have been provided to them. And so that's another thing in organizations. So again, it's like, if I give you something, one, you may not deserve it, right? Or it's going to change my status. I would say it's not the final, but just another reason that these issues may fail is many times organizations take a really short-term view on strategic planning, or, if they're a public company, then they're looking at the market. So it's very short-term view. They're looking at the next quarter and their results. And this is not, some people call DEI a marathon. I don't even use that metaphor, because a marathon eventually ends at 26.2 miles, right? This work never ends. So you're never going to get to a place where you are fully involved. You're constantly, as an organization, you're constantly going to deal with DEI issues. And so people are too short-sighted when they put initiatives in place and thinking they're going to get these fast, immediate results, but also they don't necessarily fund them adequately. And so if you don't fund something adequately, then it's a recipe for it not producing the best outcomes that it can. It doesn't mean it won't still produce some outcomes, even some positive outcomes. You just may not get the very best outcomes. And so I think you mentioned PhD Project earlier. That's an organization that's near and dear to both our hearts. And I always lift up the PhD Project as a great example of how properly funded a D&I initiative can have tremendous positive impact and outcomes. And we are living witnesses of the great work that the PhD Project does and a DEI initiative that has changed the face of business and academia. And I also know, because I served on a council, a Canadian advisory council, DEI council, that has extended past the US. Like they in Canada, there's a PhD project for schools of engineering. And so that's the type of impact this organization has had. And again, I hold it up as an example of what properly funded organization can do, or DEI initiative can do and can have if people put in the work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, PhD Project. Shout out.
Amen.
Because that is so real. It has been impactful, changed my life. I know that. And the life of so many other people. And I can't recall what the number is. Like when we started or when the PhD Project started, how many?
It was 294 in 1994. And as of today, we probably have about 1,500.
Wow.
African American, Hispanic American, Native American business professors in the country. And there's about 30,000 business school professors. So again, the number is still small.
Right, still small.
When we think about where we started in 1994, with only 294 in the country to now over 1,500. And we have about 300 doctoral students in the pipeline now. It's impressive of just in like 27 years what this organization has been able to accomplish.
Yeah, that's awesome. What 3 things would you say to the new DEI professional to help them be successful?
Right. So the first thing that I would say is, I mentioned before, this is a never-ending journey. So you must continuously delve into the research. And again, everyone is not a scholar or professor, but there are too many of us, not too many, but there's so many of us who do translational work, right? So you may not actually read the journal article that was published, but we do have a lot of translational work, like listening to podcasts or looking at the research blogs and things like that. This knowledge changes all the time, just like any field. So you can't just stay with, oh, I'm an expert. I know this and do the same things you did 20 years ago or whatever, 10 years, 5 years ago. So you have to engage in continuous learning and professional development to make sure that you are up to date in your knowledge. And I do want to say research knowledge, because that's a lot of things that people say and they use in organizations, but it may not be based in the evidence that we have. And so that's, to me, foundationally what DEI practitioners should do. The second thing I would say is you need to build coalitions, and you really need to engage in issue congruence, right? Because again, there are power struggles within organizations. So you have to try to find a way to influence the right people and to build coalitions with the right people and see what are the issues that they are concerned with, and try to merge the issues that you're concerned with in some way so that you can have people to support you when you need to be supported, and people who can also argue and advocate for the causes that you're advocating because you've made it clear that there's issue alignment. And then the last thing that I would say is that DEI practitioners should have relevant and realistic goals. Again, many of these issues are really entrenched, hundreds of years of exclusion or oppression. So it's not going to be quick fixes to any of this stuff. So you have to have realistic goals that you are working with, but you also need to keep a record, right? You need to keep an accurate record of your successes and your failures. And you need to communicate those to the relevant people, because you got to have a long-term view if you're doing this work. And if you don't keep an accurate record, you're going to find yourself, to me, flailing a lot and not being able to communicate the good that you have done up to this point and be able to articulate, perhaps what are the resources that you may need going forward to do better. And people, like people say, like they want to see receipts. So you want to make sure you keep your receipts.
That's so true. That's so true. You need those receipts to move forward. But then also, I like how you discussed the idea that we need to keep a record because we can learn from our failures too.
Right.
As well. And that's equally as important,
Absolutely.
as well.
You're not always going to get wins. I consult for organizations as well. And I have had several failures, right? And you learn from those as well. Hopefully you learn from those.
Yeah. I want to take time now to let our guests know that if you have a question, you can hold on to that question and later on, if we should have some time, you can unmute your microphone. I'll let you know when that is. Or you can also type your question in the chat and Micah can read that question to Dr. Holmes for us. Our next question is, what is the most important action, behavior, or lesson learned that you believe can help individuals reduce or mitigate their implicit bias?
So I will go back to this idea of you have to be involved in continuous learning. All of us have blind spots, and you can never think you're going to arrive to a place where you're not going to have biases. We are hardwired as humans to have some biases. And in some cases, biases are beneficial for us in terms of decision-making and things like that. Because listeners should know there are positive biases, there's negative biases, there's neutral biases. So although we constantly use the word bias as a negative, it's not always a negative thing. A bias is just a bias. It's basically just a heuristic, a decision heuristic that you're using. And so you constantly have to learn and check yourself or have others check you to say, I could have made a cultural faux pas. I could have made a mistake. I can learn something new, right? And for people who think they are above reproach, that they're not a person who's going to ever make a cultural faux pas, I think that they have already checked themselves off to the learning process. Because even as a person who publishes this work, I freely tell people I still make cultural faux pas. I am fortunate that I have people who call me in if I made a mistake about something. And the thing is, you just be willing to, acknowledge the mistake. If there's any harm done, repair the harm and commit to do better. And so I think that fundamentally, if you want to mitigate bias, you have to take that type of approach because we are human beings and human beings make mistakes. And now, granted, there are definitely some mistakes that are much more pernicious than others, right? So, for example, I say there are fireable offenses that can be a mistake. There are other mistakes that aren't fireable offense, right? It could just be a learning opportunity.
Right.
And so, if you want to mitigate bias, you have to find yourself along that continuum somewhere to constantly learn so you can try to reduce the cultural faux pas or the quote unquote identity threats or harassment or any of those type of things that you may engage in to make, your organization or your community more equitable.
Yeah, no, you make a real great point. I know Dr. Bernardo Furman's book, Inclusive Leadership. I think I got it right here around here somewhere. There's a chapter in there with Mary Frances Winters, and she talks about exposure, education, experience. So traveling to empathy is through exposure, then experience, and then education. We have to be lifelong learners because then we can fully understand people who we perceive to be different from ourselves. And part of that learning, continually doing that is really important because we can easily fall back into our old ways of thinking, right? I think. And so even with that, they talk about training and this impact, but training is not long lasting. We have to always continue to do that in organizations. Like I had a client that was like, can we do a different training this year? I was like, well, guess what? That training we did last year, we probably need to do it again to reinforce, the learning. And also if you have new employees, they need to know that new information, even if it's something simple as the foundations course of diversity or the foundations for unconscious implicit bias. So I appreciate you saying defining bias as preference. I know I was on a podcast one day and I said preference, and they were like, preference? Like, yeah, we always think of bias as negative, but It's really, it's just kind of like, it's preferencing be positive or negative. And we do need it for decision making sometimes, as you said.
Right.
What's the most important action, behavior, or lesson learned that, oh, I just asked that question. Look at me.
Yeah.
You see, I'm still trying to practice, y'all. See, I got nervous. I'm nervous because I'm with my mentor here, the one who taught me how to do podcasts. And hey, I'm transparent. It's like, hey, I'm not a podcaster. I'm not an entertainer. I'm just a professor.
No,
But,
I feel you.
but we're at the last question, the fun question. And Dr. Holmes wanted us to ask, who are your top 5 singers and why?
So I came to this list pretty quickly. And so I'm going to say the names and then hopefully the why is evident. And there's no particular order for these singers. But for my top 5, I'll say Jasmine Sullivan, Beyonce, Whitney Houston, Mariah Carey, and Stevie Wonder.
Oh, that's a good list. Oh, that's a great list.
And I will say, all of them. I'm a huge, R&B fan. I love R&B, soul music. And so for these singers that I've mentioned, they all have beautiful voices. Their catalogs are just amazing. You can play them from beginning to end. And I mean, Beyonce obviously stands. Well, I'm going to go to her concert next month. Can't wait. I mean, she has. Well, I guess she have Michael Jackson on the list too. Maybe that's 6. But all of these entertainers are people who have just accomplished so much. I don't think Jasmine Sullivan is getting all the flowers she deserves. She should actually have a lot more Grammys than she has. But all of them, they are just the truth. Like their voices, it's just amazing. Their songs are just amazing. And so, there's a lot of singers I love, but if I have to choose, those are the ones that I would say.
That's a good top 5, because you know what, their songs, their style, and their voice, it stands the test of time,
Mm-hmm.
And I love how each of those, they've been able to, the longevity, especially look at Beyonce, longevity of her career, she's been able to reinvent herself. And she's a lifelong learner of her craft, right? I mean, she listens and she's able to adapt and she's always coming out with hits.
I'm just amazed at her just transformation. Like she has really, really changed the game and has reached heights that it's at the top. It's the apex. I don't know if any other entertainer is going to ever outdo them. And so I will put her up there as people who have been as transformational as Michael Jackson.
Yeah. I agree. Who would have thought? Destiny's Child.
Right.
Like later now. So I guess if y'all have any questions, now's the time to place them in the chat, or you can unmute your microphone at this time if you want to personally ask Dr. Holmes a question. Now, everyone at once, every time we do this, it's like we wait and then.
Don't be shy.
Oh, here we go. Oh, Rosalind, you have a question.
Good evening. Good evening, Dr. Holmes. So I just had a question, just this recent last week, I think, right? SB 17. A lot of people have been talking about this coming out of Texas. It reflects a lot of what's going on in Florida about, taking away funding for DEI and these consequences for people found to be in error. And they tend to get larger and larger, the consequences, if you're found to go and do it anyways. So just what are your thoughts and recommendations? Because they say we have until, January of 2024 to start implementation of that. But it seems like that's going to happen, before anybody is able to stop or challenge or anything like that. So how do we best move forward in this climate? What are your recommendations for that?
That's a great question, Rosalind. And what I will say is I'm really disappointed with this type of legislation that is popping up across the country, right? This type of backlash to DEI efforts is something that is predictable in the sense that we look at our history, because we've seen backlash like this before across our history. And it goes back to what I said previously about this threat to power that people have, right? And they're trying to protect their power or their sense of power and trying to oppress others. And so I'm very disappointed that, elected officials are choosing to push this type of legislation across our country. It does not create a more perfect union for us as a country. It further entrench the oppressive laws and oppressive systems that we already have in place. Now, how to respond to this? I think a top down and a bottom up approach is necessary, right? You have to have people in power, legislators who are against this, to be more vocal. So writing those Congress people to try to get them to be more vocal about fighting, these type of things, maybe writing to influential business leaders in the area, perhaps reaching out to chambers of commerce, the leaders in chambers of commerce to lobby, quote unquote, lobby, right, on behalf to get these things to either not pass or overturn them. These are obviously not easy fixes, right? It's not easy to do, and it takes a lot of people, a lot of effort to build these grassroots causes and organizations. And so, I wish I had a better answer in terms of how to defeat this type of stuff. But at the end of the day, we need, we need judges to also, basically decide on these cases to say that they're unconstitutional and to strike them down, either doing it that way. Or we need judges to say, the way districts are drawn in red line that, they need to be redrawn so that people who do vote can actually vote people in office that are going to be representative to the values that we have. But again, these are not quick fixes at all. And I feel like I'm inadequately answering your question because there are no easy answers to your question, right? It's going to be a very tough fight ahead of all of us. And so I mean, if there's information sharing, reaching out to like-minded people and similar organizations, whether it's organizations like the NAACP, they have legal defense groups that also do a lot of this advocacy work and legal work to push cases through, or other types of established organizations who have funded legal departments to be able to assist with kind of like either stopping these things from passing or trying to overturn them when they do pass. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
You are.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think what you gave some great feedback for that question. This is a new thing that we're encountering right now. I know that it's very difficult, hands are tied for those of us in higher ed who receive a lot of funding from the state. But I do know that maybe some private institutions, and also I know some non-for-profits who are redirecting their funding so that their private funding is now allocated to a lot of their DEI efforts. And so that's just like one temporary short-term, I wouldn't even call it a strategy, it's a tactic people try to employ. But I guess we'll learn more as we move forward. But yeah, thanks for tackling that question. That's a tough question. Thank you for the question, Rosalind.
It really is tough. Yeah, it's a great question, but it's definitely a tough one for sure.
Yeah.
I don't think it has one answer, right? I don't think it's a one fix to it. I think you need definitely a multi-pronged approach to attack it from a variety of different areas.
Absolutely. And any other questions from any of our guests? Oh, wow. Dr. Holmes, she just broke it all down for her. Well, that's great. Man, I think this first time we've only had one question. That's okay.
Dr.
I'm
Lambert.
not surprised. Hey.
I just had one question. You were saying something I didn't catch at all, if you would mind repeating it. You were mentioning that as we're traveling through empathy, what we need to get to empathy. You mentioned experience, education, and I think you mentioned something else, but I wasn't typing fast enough.
That's right. So that was exposure. And,
Exposure. Okay.
Yeah, that information comes from Inclusive. Here it is right here. Inclusive Leadership, edited by Bernardo Ferdman, Janine Prime, and Ronald E. I don't want to mispronounce his name. Origio. And there's a chapter, I think, written by Mary Frances Winters, where she talks about that. She talks about how to get to empathy as a way to, and lifelong learning through education, exposure. It could be something simple as, there weren't many examples, but I like to talk about examples of attending some sort of a a cultural festival that you ordinarily wouldn't go to. It can just start with just, watching television programs that you ordinarily do not watch, right? I have some of my colleagues who I introduced the show Blackish to them, for example, and it enlightened them, and for me, a lot of the stuff I live, but for them, it was like new information. But things like it can just be watching a TV program you normally don't watch. So then you won't feel as discomfort in having these conversations, difficult conversations, which is also a term used by Mary Frances Wonders, because they have to happen. They have to happen. But that was it. The exposure, experience, and education to lead to empathy.
Thank you.
I would love to have more questions or comments from your audience. And so please feel free. Don't be scared.
Yeah, everybody's so shy today. You can always put it in the chat. You can always type it in the chat.
While people may think of something or type it in the chat, I will say one of the other things that I've learned in general, and it's not necessarily just about DEI, but I have found it to be impactful of how I think about a lot of things, is this objectivity myth. Because one of the things that people think about in terms of getting rid of bias, mitigating bias, they think that creating quote unquote objective outcomes, right, is the answer, is the panacea to mitigating bias in organizations. Because to many people, it's something that's subjective, right? It lends itself for some of the negative biases to creep in. And so if you have an quote unquote objective outcome, then that deals with this issue sufficiently. And one of the research projects that I was working on, that it really came out to me how much of a myth this objectivity is, right? And so the study wasn't about attorneys, but I just happened to have a good deal of attorneys who I surveyed and interviewed in this study. And so if we think about the law and we think about the career of an attorney, right, the things that they need to do to make partner is like the rank of ascension of making it, right? You have to bring in money, right? And so people look at the clients you bring in, the money you bring in, they look at that as an objective measure, right? It's like, Dr. Lambert, you brought in $10 million. I brought in $5 million. So objectively, you did better than me, right? But one of the really poignant things that I learned through this study, right, is all of the attorneys, not all of them, but the majority of the women attorneys talked about the sexual harassment they experienced being an attorney, the quid pro quo types of, conversations that came up, all of the other uneasy and again, sexual harassment. I'm not sugarcoating it. It's like just sexual harassment that they experienced being a woman attorney. None of them men attorneys mention any of this, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you take an example like that in terms of you have objective outcomes, and we know in the legal field is male dominated, right? And so not only is gender either an advantage or disadvantage for some people, you have to realize that the work experiences that people have, the work context in which people work could be very different. And so even when you have quote unquote objective measures or outcomes, you have to be diligent to try to uncover what is the process of how people got to these types of outcomes, right? What were the headwinds and tailwinds that some people faced to get to these outcomes? And so, no, when it comes to DEI, objective measures, that's not a panacea as well to eliminate or mitigate bias in organizations. In fact, you have to have some subjectivity to make it fairer in this process, right? Because you just can't look at outcomes.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's a very good point. Very good point.
We have some activity in the chat here. K Bank says, I am still learning about DEI and how we have to keep learning and not stay in the old way of things, but to be up to date with these conversations. And then Danica.
I'm still learning too.
Absolutely. Danica has a question. During this highly divisive time in our history, how do you come out of your bunker or open your world outside of your professional world to those that usually don't see your life?
Great question, Danica. And so before I think about answering that question, I'm going to ask you a question. So I hope you don't mind unmuting to answer the question that I ask you. And I'm not being facetious. Hold on. So can you tell me in a time in our history where you think it wasn't highly divisive?
Well, I don't think it was, but I do think that we personally, in my experience, we tend to gravitate to our own in order to protect ourselves. And I felt in the last few years that I have had to hunker down and protect. And so what I see as you as an expert, I think you might be able to make some, brainstorming ideas and say, you know what, this is how you could do that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for responding. And so the reason why I asked that question, because it, even in the news, it's stated all the time about, highly divisive. And it's often stated in a sense that this is something new, right? Like there was a good old days or a good time and things have regressed to some worse, situations for us. And so that's why I just always want to ask the question, because I don't think there's a time in our history where we haven't been highly divisive, right? Based on just the history of our country. And I, despite where we are today, I definitely think there have been improvements, right, to our society along the way. And so, I don't see this time we live in now, even with all of the challenges we have now, to be a worse period in our history than, say even 50 years ago. And which to me, it's much more highly divisive at that point. So I just want to, answer that part of the question to hopefully offer some reframing for people listening to the conversation when we think about that type of framing with these issues. The second thing is, I guess, is how do you come out of your bunker, or if you feel like if you have to protect. I would go back to what I mentioned before about the zero-sum mentality versus integrative mentality, right? So if I will wonder, what is it that I feel like I have to protect? And if I am looking at this protection from a closed mind perspective or an open mind perspective, right? Like if I'm protecting some perceived power, perceived status, perceived value resource that I have. So am I opportunity hoarding something that I want to protect? Or am I looking at protection in terms of I want to protect my mental health or something like that? Like I want to protect myself. Like I receive identity threats, right? I deal with all of these issues. So I'm trying to protect myself from dealing with the identity threats that I experience in the world. So I would say, look at what type of protection you are trying to hunker down in and to see what is the foundation for that protection. It is perfectly great, right, for someone to engage in self-care, to engage in self-protection mechanisms if they are experiencing these type of threats. But if you're saying the protection is rooted in like opportunity forward, like it's a power that you feel like you're losing because other people may have more opportunities, more doors or windows are opening for them, then I think that's rooted in a different ideology and a different, perhaps a value system. And that's where things like podcasts on DEI or books, influential books and things that can help perhaps open the perspective to other ways of looking at the world and not seeing it as a zero sum, like you're losing something if there's an opportunity being made available for some other group. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah. And if I could add to that, I would say like also, I wish I could think of some of the theoretical frameworks to talk about of how we are able to kind of share parts of us that we might ordinarily be fearful of sharing, right? But
like the disclosure.
Like disclosure, and it's some ways we do that. And this also might speak to some of the compensatory strategies that individuals engage in as well to kind of to kind of either minimize their identity through, I think, what the humor, avoidance. What could you speak on that? Some of the compensatory strategies that might be something that might be helpful too with her.
Oh, well, there's a lot of individual strategies that people can engage in, like, you mentioned humor. Someone perhaps may say a joke that perhaps may threaten your identity, but you laugh it off, or you tell a joke in response to lighten the mood. That's a compensatory strategy that people use. Some people engage in, splinting, so where they may put forth one identity that is more salient than others, and withhold other pieces, or they try to use a bridge that identity to another topic or conversation that they're having. And so another strategy that people use is trying to find some common ground, right, with other people. And so if you take a subordinate identity, maybe that being of a parent, if you find out someone else is a parent, you try to make that identity be connection that you bond over, and you may not even bring up some of the other salient identities that you have. But the list is long of in the moment types of strategies that people can engage in to try to mitigate the perceived threat that they're dealing with at the moment. In one of the papers that I wrote, I uncovered 9 of them, right? Mm-hmm. So they say, one of the ones that perhaps a lot of people hear about is constructive action, right? It's this idea of I'm going to try to prove you wrong, right? And so they use it as fuel to motivate them to prove that person wrong. Another strategy people use is seek assistance or seek help. It may be reaching out to an ally, or going to HR, or going to a manager in order to help them deal with the identity threat or the situation. So there's a lot of strategies that people can use. Yeah. I will say humor can be effective, but humor is a tricky one because it can be difficult to pull off humor in the appropriate way. And so it's definitely a strategy that I suggest people use with caution.
It can backfire.
Right.
Yeah. And I think and I know from personal experience, some of what you mentioned, especially trying to establish common ground, right? Then at least for me, the goal is over time, then I can eventually begin to share more of, I think, what you said of your world to those who don't see my life. So kind of like just cracking the door up just a little bit, maybe sharing what we have in common. And there over time, when we develop maybe a stronger relationship, a more deeper, professional, intimate relationship, and that trust is built. And then from there, maybe you can share part of yourself. Because as the Black man in academia, and you heard the statistics from the PhD project, there aren't too many of us. I find myself having to do that, just kind of share bits and pieces of me over time, because I fear that I might be judged, that they might want to know about my life growing up, South Side, Chicago, gangs, drugs, all the other stuff. Like, I have to get to know you first before you know about my life. But that shapes my perspective too.
Right.
And that also helps me in what I do and made me who I am today. And so maybe that can be a start if I'm understanding your question correctly about coming out of your, quote unquote, coming out of your bunker,
Right. It's the foundation of trust, right? Trust is about being your willingness to be vulnerable towards others. And so that information disclosure, that selective information disclosure, is one of the ways in which people develop trust and build relationships over time. Think about it. If you're on a first date, you're not going to reveal all of yourself on a first date, right? Like, there's some emotional intelligence that goes into play in terms of like how much you talk about yourself. And all of us engage in impression management from time to time, right? And so it's the give and take of relationships in terms of how people disclose information. And if it's reciprocal, and if it builds upon a foundation of mutual respect and curiosity, and, clearly not instrumental, right? Like you're just trying to gain something that's one-sided. Typically relationships will develop, and you will be able to get to know that person and other people, and perhaps be able to put down some of your guards.
Yeah. Thank you. Yep. You said it perfectly. Great example. That's why we have Dr. Holmes IV here on the show to break stuff down for us. We are at the top of the hour. We are at time. I want to thank all of my guests for showing up. Thank you for your questions. And thank you, Micah, doing the magic behind the scenes. Especially thank you, Dr. Holmes. I know you said, you're going to call me Dr. Holmes the whole time? Thank you for being here.
That's my pleasure. Right. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too. All right, guests. Enjoy your day. Peace out from Dr. J.